Hello and welcome to another episode of the Express Economist. This week I have a very special guest, Professor Adam Tooze. Thank you for being on the show, sir. Professor Tooze is Professor of History at Columbia University and one of the leading thinkers of our time. And we are meeting on the sidelines of the CPR Dialogues. It's the third annual CPR Dialogues that's happening in New Delhi. So thank you, sir, first of all, for being part of the show. And I wanted to ask, the first question has to be about United Kingdom and the crisis unfolding there. Right. First of all, if you could tell us what exactly has led to this crisis. The mini budget was presented and all of a sudden UK has its currency, bond yields, everything in a tizzy. What has led to that?
Well, I think the backdrop is deeper. I mean, it goes back really to the Brexit decision in 2016. So there was a referendum in which a narrow majority of the population, led by the right wing of the Tory party, opted to exit the EU. And this was a decision taken in the face of every single serious economic opinion in the world. The IMF, the European leaders, bankers, the American president, everyone, the vast majority of economists in Britain. And in a sense, ever since that moment, we've been waiting for the shoe to drop. We've been waiting for markets to punish an irresponsible, nationalist, sort of willful. It's not fair to say that they're populist. The current crop of Tories are not populist in the simple sense of the word. They're actually pro-business in their own minds. They believe they're on a crusade to rid Britain of regulation and lower taxes so as to increase incentives, but they are disregarding of market sensibility. And what the markets are worried about is the fact that they, in very short succession, passed a gigantic energy price stabilization bill. So the other immediate factor operating here is that Europe, as a result of Russia's war on Ukraine and tensions in global gas markets worldwide, which were already manifest in 2021, is suffering an epic energy crisis. I mean, really extraordinary. At times, gas prices have been the equivalent of $1,000 a barrel oil. So really extraordinary prices. And the government passed a package almost immediately on taking office a couple of weeks ago, valued at £150 billion. That's about 5% of GDP. And then announced they were going to do a budget. And the budget then announced a further £45 billion of tax cuts in the form of just giveaways, not investment, not targeted on anything, just literally giveaways to overwhelmingly the most affluent British people. And somewhat surprisingly, given that the markets are full of the people who will benefit from the tax cut, the markets freaked out because all of a sudden they sensed that this government just didn't know any boundaries. Now, defenders of the government will say what they expect the Bank of England to do is to jack the interest rate up, and that's part of the plan, and that in due course, in a couple of weeks' time in November, the government will present a programme to slash government spending so as to bring the government balance into balance. And what the markets are basically signalling is they don't like this programme. It doesn't make sense to them. The spending doesn't seem well targeted. There's no reason to believe it will deliver more rapid growth. This is the idea is a sort of supply side idea that if you slash taxes in due course, you'll produce so much growth that the tax revenue will go back up again. The whole thing has a kind of 1980s Reagan type feel. And that includes the fact that you, as it were, shelter a expansive fiscal policy with a tight monetary policy, because that's what America did in the 1980s. And so that was their idea, but they did not get their ducks in the row. They did not communicate this to the markets, and the markets don't buy it because it really doesn't add up as a programme. It will not accelerate British growth. And so what you're basically saying is you're going to add very substantially to the debt burden without accelerating growth. And even in a calm market, you therefore expect interest rates to go up and things to stabilise. What actually began to unfold was something much more panicky, which is that people tried to get out of all UK assets, so the exchange rate started going down, which isn't normally something you see in advanced economies, but it's a sudden stop, emerging market type spiral. So that got people freaked out. And then there are a bunch of really technical factors operating in the UK treasury market, the gilt market, the famous British government debt market that goes all the way back to the 17th century, in which pension funds are very heavily invested in long-run government debt, because that's the kind of debt you need if you're going to pay pensions 20 or 30 years from now, because they'll roll off and you get your money back and you'll earn an interest in the meantime. And rising interest rates are good for pension investors, right, in general, because it's going to help them with their long-run strategies. But a lot of these pension funds had hedged against the prospect of rising interest rates, to give them cover against any particular type of interest movement. And the sudden adjustment in interest rates in and of itself was enough to unwind those hedging strategies and force the pension funds to cover. They were then asked for more collateral on these deals, and then they had to start selling. And what they sold off was what they thought of as the most stable kind of asset, which is the Treasury, the gilt. Yeah. And that began to then produce a really toxic spiral, because as people start selling in this panicky way, you get fire sales spreading across the entire market. So much so that early this week, the Bank of England decided that financial stability was at risk, which basically means the house of cards that is the financial system. And any financial system is a house of cards. Let's be clear. It's always based on it's a fragile pyramid, right? And we can build it very, very high, but it rests on confidence and a series of interlocking expectations. And those began to disintegrate. And so that's why we're in the situation that we're in. I still expect this government to ride this out. They'll be hugely unpopular by the time they're done. The interest rate will go up. It will savage the UK housing market, because we're talking about an interest rate increase from around about 1 or 2% to 6% by next year. So they're doubling or tripling, and UK mortgages are not fixed for 30 years like they are in the US. They roll over. So even a long-term fixed one is 5 years. So there's going to be millions of households that have to refinance at interest rates which are double or triple what they expected. And the real estate market in the UK is the alpha and omega. It's the foundation of middle and upper middle class wealth. And so that's most likely going to go into freefall in the coming months. We've already seen mortgage lenders stop making loans.
But why do you think that the government will be able to ride out, considering that this is so fundamentally disastrous?
Because they can hang in there. It's a Westminster system. They've got a decently large majority. They may have a rebellion. I mean, I may prove wrong. This is a political bet, and you'd have to talk to a Westminster analyst to really get a clear read on this. But there is a way in which, and this is, I think, the prevalent view in Downing Street right now, is they're just kind of bunker mentality. They're hunkering down. And the markets hate that, because what the markets want to see is politicians who care. And it's not obvious that they do, and that's part of the panic here.
So I want to come to that question about the choice of policies of giving tax cuts and then perhaps stimulating growth a little later. But I want to ask you before that two things. One, about the kind of cost of living crisis that we hear about in UK. Many in India, there are large proportions of India live in considerable poverty and considerable stress. To hear such stories of cost of living crisis in UK, if you could just give us a perspective of how deep is that, and then I wanted to ask you about UK's broader stagnation. But
I mean, like other advanced economies, so-called advanced economies, rich world economies, the UK has very large inequality, not as extreme as in India, but nevertheless very pronounced by any standard. And a substantial percent of the population, particularly kids in divorced families with single parents, notably women, mothers, and elderly people dependent on the state pension, who are by Western standards in poverty conditions, which means by Western standards that they have to think hard about whether they can afford food at the end of the week, which means that they think hard about whether they turn the heating up in the winter. This does not mean that they're living rough. It does not mean that they struggle to, maintain a roof over their heads, but it means that they struggle to provide themselves with what, by any standard, really ought to be a decent life, right? And we're talking about, so remember, it depends on what measure you apply, 20 to 30% of the population in the UK. So a considerable number. And this has a real effect. So if you look at mortality in Britain over the year, there is an excess mortality spike over the winter months, which tells you that elderly, frail people are not heating adequately, they get pneumonia and then they die. But we're not talking about starvation in any simple sense of the word, or that kind of deprivation, but we are talking about malnutrition in the sense of inadequate protein, inadequate vitamin provision, people relying essentially on cheap carbohydrates to cope. So that is the scale of the problem. But any Western visitor to India rapidly adjusts to a giant difference. But the problem is real. It leads to stunting, to underdeveloped children. It leads to brain damage in children who grow up poor. It systematically disadvantages kids who then fail in education as well. So it is a persistent pattern of considerable poverty, deprivation. And in Europe, increasingly one speaks of poverty as social exclusion, right? So it's not a absolute poverty, but it's an inability to fully participate in society and politics as a result of this, of these deprivations. And that crisis fluctuates with the cost of living, because many of the people in this condition are living on government benefits. Those are fixed at relatively modest levels by European standards. The Tory government since 2010 has introduced a more and more rationed, more and more contained, more and more punitive benefit system. And as the cost of living surges, and particularly for cheap food items, the families in that situation, households in that situation, begin to face really severe choices. And as the cost of energy has surged, and in Europe, though the energy prices are controlled, they're not capped absolutely, or they were not capped until this new government came in. People were looking at energy bills which were rising from a few £1,000s in total for a year to £6,000, £7,000, £8,000. So quadrupling of energy bills. My mother, who's a pensioner in the UK, if she was living on her state pension alone, would have faced spending about 30 to 40% of her state pension income on her energy bill. So that is a shock by any standard, and so this is a crisis which has been brewing in Britain really since the end of COVID, since 2021, where we saw prices begin to surge, and the current energy price shock is really amplifying that massively.
And over a longer term, recently we had the news about India overtaking the UK as the 5th largest economy, and we all got a chance to perhaps revisit how UK has done. And I was looking at some data in GDP. If we look at GDP terms from 2007 to 2021, UK's GDP has sort of remained range bound. It has sort of stagnated. So what is causing that? Is there an issue with stagflation now that the UK economy, or maybe possibly broadly the world economy, is facing? But UK specific, is it stagflation because the economy has been stagnant for a very long time?
Yeah, well, congratulations first of all on the overtaking. It's real, I think. There's no reason to doubt it. It's not a per capita measure, obviously, and India is a vastly larger society, I mean, more than 20 times larger in terms of population, so it's not surprising that there's clearly a kind of historic validation in this overtaking, which one can't help appreciating. But the problems of the UK economy are grievous, and they are historic. Like never before in modern British history have we had a period of such low growth and such low productivity growth. And that's really the key here. And I think there are a variety of different factors at play. One is that the financial sector was a huge part of the British economy during the relatively rapid growth phase of the 1990s and the early 2000s. And the 2008 financial crisis hit the City of London incredibly hard, knocks out that growth driver. After that, there is then a chronic problem of underinvestment. So Britain has one of the lowest shares of investment in GDP of any of the rich economies of the world. It's around 15-16%. It's far too low to generate really rapid growth. And then the third element here is Brexit, which compounds that problem. Right? So will generate inefficiencies, will cost GDP, and provides very little incentive for investment. You add all of those three things up, you add in some other persistent problems, inequality and the inadequate training, for instance, and a reduction in the flow of migrants into the British economy, which were dynamising British growth in the 90s and the 2000s. And it's a pretty dismal picture all around. There are very powerful divisions in the British economy, British society, between parts which are dynamic, competitive, very globally orientated, above all around London, and large parts of Britain, the so-called left behind, which are post-industrial and have still not recovered really from the deindustrialisation that happened in Britain in the 70s, 80s and 90s. And so those problems become more and more persistent with time, and Britain does not have an integrative growth model that allows the entire country to grow together, if you like, in a kind of common prosperity, as the Chinese might say. That is not the experience of Britain in recent years. It's a serious matter of concern, I think, because unless you can grow the cake, and we really are now talking about a pretty major divergence between Britain and the more rapidly growing advanced economies, unless you can grow the cake, all the other problems become more and more difficult. And then politics becomes more bitter because it's a zero-sum distributional struggle.
Yeah. And globally, there's been a lot of talk about recession now, primarily driven by the Ukraine the war in Ukraine and all the supply bottlenecks that it's created. Do you see this is just a matter of recession with higher interest rates, or a broader stagflation, which is a bigger concern as you see it?
I think there are three options: crisis, recession, stagflation, right? And we might see all three in different variants depending on which part of the world you're in. Obviously, if you're in Sri Lanka, you're already experiencing existential crisis, right? Or Pakistan. So the weakest links in the global chain, as interest rates go up, which is the overall global driver of the recessionary pressure, the weakest links in the global credit chain will snap, right? And the more defended you are, the larger your foreign currency reserves, the less your debt is in dollars, the more resilient you will be in the face of this. Because we are currently seeing the historically most widely dispersed, most comprehensive increase in interest rates we have ever in the history of the world economy. It's not the most rapid increase, that was in the late 70s and early 80s, but practically every central bank in the world, other than Japan and China, is actually raising rates. And that is exercising a squeeze, and those effects are then ramifying, right? So you get collateral effects from each individual central bank raising their rates. So the question really is, do we end up with recession or do we end up with stagflation? The difference would be that, with the stagflation, we would be saying that we get a slowdown in growth without success in countering inflation.
Right.
With a recession, you would expect inflation to come down pretty rapidly, because the major driver in the end of inflation will be a rise in unemployment and less steam in the economy. So that, I think, is the trade-off. In the short run, we're going to get stagflation. In the short run, what we're going to see is a dramatic slowdown in growth, and we're going to see inflation almost everywhere in the world above 5%, which is well above the average in recent decades. And so that would qualify for stagflation. When the Chinese economy slows down to 2 or 3%, and the overall growth rate of the world is down, in the 2, 3, 4% range, and we've got inflation above 5%, that will be our modern definition of stagflation. I think there is a risk of recession. Because the interest rate pressure that's being applied is increasingly steep. It's rising now quite rapidly, and that's in part because prices are proving recalcitrant and not slowing down as rapidly as many of us hoped. I still believe that this will be a transitory inflationary burst. I don't expect us to stabilize at inflation above 5% for very long. A lot of these effects are coming from the energy sector and the food sector, and those effects are going into reverse now. But it's going to be interesting to see. I wouldn't expect an economy like India's to go into recession. That would be very surprising, I think. Nor China. We'll see a growth slowdown. But in the West, in Europe in particular, which is in the front line of this economic war, I think the likelihood now is of recession, because the hits to the consumer is so substantial.
So this brings me to the question about the role of monetary policy in this kind of a scenario where prices are rising essentially because of supply issues, and there are a lot of people on the street would very openly ask, how would your raising interest rates actually solve the prices for gas or petroleum prices? So what is the and typically we've learned about second order effects, but I want to ask you, is this a good idea in your view for central banks to really tighten interest rates, say for an economy like India, which is just trying to get back its growth, to raise interest rates sharply for that argument that second order effects of wage price spiral should not happen? Is that a valid sort of way to approach it?
In general, I think in general one should be extremely cautious on this front, right? Because wage adjustment in an inflation should be considered as the normal part of the inflationary process. Because otherwise, what you're doing is sort of shrugging your shoulders and say, well, we should have a redistribution from workers whose real incomes will fall to the producers of goods, capital in other words, who will benefit from the first round inflationary price adjustment. And that seems inequitable. It's certainly not something a central bank has any business pronouncing on. Central banks are there not to redistribute income, especially not in a regressive direction. They're there for price.
The workers are losing out if you do that, because they're not able to adjust.
And if you're using them and their unemployment as the weapon with which to reduce inflation, you have to be very explicit about what this distributional bargain is, and it's a very tough one. And it's even more problematic if the inflation, as you say, is being driven by cost factors on which interest rates can have only a very marginal effect. So I think the question really is the balance of judgment, right? And so take the United States. In the United States, we're seeing something much more akin to a classic inflation. In other words, wages are now, in fact, more or less in line with prices. When that happens, you can say we are seeing a general uplift in the entire economy, so general mechanisms for slowing the economy down, interest rates which will, for instance, act on the housing market, which is a big employer of construction workers, are not in an appropriate tool in a situation like that, right? Especially because America is not experiencing a massive energy price shock. In Europe, what they've de facto decided to do is combine very modest increases in interest rates, because the interest rate is still well below the inflation rate, so we're still talking about negative interest rates de facto, with efforts to directly control the energy price. And if you had told me 12 months ago that we were going to see price controls on energy in Europe, I would have laughed at you. But that is where we're at right now, because they understand this logic. It doesn't make any sense to try and deal with a supply-driven, cost-driven inflation shock by an interest rate increase.
Okay, that gives me an opportunity to also ask you, a question that again a lot of people are asking, that when countries have loose monetary policy, lots of money is pumped at very low rates. In particular, say even the US Fed doing it, and then India also, especially at a time, say with the COVID pandemic, it all sounds very natural, very reasonable. And there would definitely be a positive set of results as a result of that. But so much loose money, cheap money, does not really flow to each section of the economy in the same manner. And I would suspect that an economy which is iniquitous in more ways than one would perhaps also have the money flowing to them and the benefits of loose monetary policy flowing to them in different manner. So the question is, does that kind of loose monetary policy, which is done in the name of welfare, actually worsen inequalities? What's your take on that?
Well, it's a fascinating question. It's really interesting that this is put this way nowadays, because this critique is an Austrian critique, right? This is Austrian economics, which asks about the specific microeconomic distributional effects of credit creation, and it's generally a conservative argument against loose monetary policy, because as you splurge money into the economy, it's the less efficient, the less profitable projects that actually get credit, get finance, and so it's bad for overall economic efficiency, is the Austrian argument. And what's fascinating is that since 2008, with the advent of unconventional monetary policy, there's a left-wing version of this argument, which is a sort of critique of capitalist political economy, which says exactly as you suggest, that unsurprisingly, existing entrenched interests will have better access to credit, which is why they're existing in entrenched interests, because they had access to credit, right? I mean, this was a process of capital accumulation which put them in this position. So how do we respond? Like, is the answer then to say, well, a less expansively monetary policy? Well, that can't be the answer, because that's a recipe for recession, right? That's a recipe for unemployment. The big payoff from an expansionary monetary policy in a situation like 2020 or 2009 is that it prevents mass unemployment. Because if you don't provide the credit, what you're going to end up with is bankruptcies, which are irreversible, one-off, irretrievable losses which you can't get back, right? So you use the monetary policy to keep the circulatory system of the economy going, right? So you don't have a heart attack. That's why you do it. If we now discover that it has these sorts of distributional consequences, then surely the answer is, let's do structural reform. Let's ask about access to credit. Let's do questions about financial, the availability of credit to the entire society, financial inclusion, in other words. Let's ensure that it isn't just the big businesses that gain access to low interest credit, but that small businesses gain too. And then let's use fiscal policy. Let's use redistributive taxation up to and including a wealth tax if we want to claw back some of the effects. Because otherwise what you end up doing is, if you like, sort of cutting off your nose to spite your face. You refuse to do an expansionary monetary policy because it'll have bad distributional consequences and therefore doom yourself to mass unemployment. That's not a sensible policy, right? Do the expansionary monetary policy, prevent the mass unemployment, and then use other instruments to offset the undesirable effects. But I mean, what this highlights is the fact that managerial short-run macro policy avoiding unemployment is not revolutionary politics. It's not about transforming society. Broadly speaking, as you say, what it will do is entrench and reinforce the existing structure of inequality. And nothing reveals that more transparently than 2020, right? I mean, the huge subsidies that were provided in the advanced economies were explicitly about preserving the status quo. Did they have positive side effects? They did. And look in the United States, where it's incredibly graphic, the unemployment rate for black men, who are the most disadvantaged group in the American labour market, is currently at its historic low level. Donald Trump actually had a very low rate at the beginning of 2020 because the economy was running hot. He used to boast about this. He said he was the best president for black Americans since Lincoln, or maybe even better than Lincoln. Right? So, I mean, he's crazy, but the bigger point is that this does have a distributional consequence, which is positive, the employment policy. But the wealth effects are real, and we know that actually also on the race gradient, that white households in the United States benefit much more from loose monetary policy than black households do, because they can get the leverage and pile into assets and do the accumulating. So that you relying on monetary policy alone will indeed tend to reinforce existing power and wealth hierarchies. And so there's no substitute, if you're serious about reformist economic policy, to apply other measures as well.
So that's my cue to ask you about neoliberal policies, neoliberalism. A lot of people, even outside India, have been saying that doesn't work typically, and that set of policies, that day is over. When I look at India, we have a central bank which has an inflation targeting regime. It doesn't talk about employment as being even a variable. None of the reports talk about it. And we have a government which now increasingly is following the agenda, which is that, growth will come from the private sector. We need to cut taxes. So corporate tax rates have been cut to historic lows. And the hope is that private sector will start investing, and that's how the growth will happen. And government should remain like playing a very minimalist role. And we have a history of massive government intervention and sort of rolling back the state. Now, how do you sort of see that, this whole debate maybe in a context of India, where you have millions upon millions of openly unemployed people? I mean, the numbers are mind-boggling. At any rate, there are like 40 million people openly unemployed, and we have one of the lowest labor force participation rates. So if the labor force participation rates were similar to, say, a US or a UK, perhaps the openly unemployed people would run into, would quadruple. So how do you sort of look at this policy choice and the realities in India?
Yeah, and the openly unemployed people tend to be men, and the non-openly unemployed women. India has this astonishingly
20% of labor force participation for women.
I mean, it's insane waste of human potential, right? So there's a vast development problem here, right? And the question of the adequacy of neoliberal equations to a society as complex and enormous and facing the kind of challenges that India is. I'm sensible and modest enough to recognise that that's not my job to comment on. I mean, these are huge problems. I mean, the foundation has got to be investment. Any policy that enables you to raise the investment rate in infrastructure and education and health is good for your growth rate, right? So, I mean, it should really be a four elements: R&D, education, health, and infrastructure. And that's what's missing in India. It's simply not. The rate is much better than it was, but nowhere near high enough. Your spending on R&D, given your talent pool, is absurdly low. The health sector spending is very, very low indeed, and there has been obviously a historic failure of public education for the youth bulge, right? And there are vast problems now in redressing the problems created by having hundreds of millions of workers in the workforce whose skill levels are not adequate to 21st century labour market challenges. So those are the issues. To my mind, set the labels aside, ask yourself the question how you raise. That should be the monolithic focus. And because that will also then generate jobs, that will generate employment opportunities. Where that investment comes from, whether it's tiny firms, whether it's giant private enterprises, whether it's the government, there's got to be a role for all three, right? I mean, I don't think India can afford to choose between the three, right? China doesn't choose, the Europeans and the United States don't choose, South Korea, Japan, none of the success stories. And India is a success story. on the basis of a blend, right, of different mechanisms. We all know that the banking system is largely in public hands. Should bits of it be privatized? Why not? Create kind of competitive environments. There's parts of the electricity generating system that are shambolic and relatively failed attempts to combine the two things together, public and private. Has a lot to do with how prices are set, right? So how are you going to restructure the pricing system such that private enterprise can, in fact, profitably invest? All of these questions would have to be unpicked and addressed. Right now, there really isn't, in the wider world outside, a clear one best way, one size fits all prescription. We're no longer in the 1990s, right? So we have incredible experiments with industrial policy being run in Europe and the United States right now, which again, if you'd asked me 2 or 3 years ago whether we would see $50 billion allocated to government sponsorship of microchip manufacturing in the United States, I would have laughed, right? But what is that? That's actually some sort of private-public hybrid model. But when we face challenges like the energy transition, it seems to me that there are, and in the Indian case, that's a misnomer, because really what we're talking about is increasing energy consumption in a sustainable way, right? The fundamental question is simply finance. How do you mobilize the resource, and how does India become the incredible dynamo of technological innovation it could so easily be, and in certain sectors already is, right? So, I mean, those I think are the key questions. And a non-dogmatic, pragmatic approach is we haven't got time. I mean, we don't have time. You don't have time given the demographic pressures. The world doesn't have time because of the climate crisis. I mean, we just need all of the above approach to these issues. And I mean, what is fascinating in India, coming to India from the outside, is the experimentalism with regard to various types of welfare delivery system in the rural areas, in the most poor parts of the country, in the development of digital identification mechanisms, which allow India in a really precocious way to deliver support. I mean, as bad as the COVID experience was, people didn't starve in the way that perhaps in the past they might have, given the disruption we were talking about, right? Absolutely. And those achievements are significant and need to be built on not just as a safety net, but more as a trampoline, right? So that this can actually enable this huge, incredibly talented population to elevate in the way that it ought to be able to do. The problem, of course, is the structures aren't there in the same way. The institutional structures aren't there, in part because of the legacies of colonialism, in part because of the backlash against colonialism, in part because of the developmentalism of the 50s and 60s, and then the backlash against that. So India is working, as it were, against the backdrop of a series of chops and changes and changed policies one way or the other. It doesn't have the institutional stability that, say, China does in this respect. It doesn't have the same platform to work on. There are huge and persistent differences in the provision of education and health between India and China. The basic urban infrastructure is radically different. And no one would wish the Chinese model on India. It's radically different history. We know the choices that were made in the 1940s at the moment of liberation, and the struggle that was carried on there, and the choices that were made at that moment. Those have historical consequences, and I think the question really is, how does a modern Indian state build the institutional fabric, whether public or private, to provide that platform?
So last question on how sort of you see India. I mean, China was very different, and for the longest time the West kept berating China and its model, but China kept growing. And it grew without political freedoms and social freedoms perhaps, but it kept growing. Now there are some questions, and I remember in one of the recent interviews somebody asked you also about whether China is facing a middle income trap. India is not even there in terms of middle income. We are at a low income. So if there is a trap, then it's going to be a low income trap. But when you look at India, we are going to overtake China in terms of population in maybe a year or 2 or 3, depending on which estimate you check. But we are one of the most populous countries, massive unemployment. And as you said, there is no time. When you look at India from outside, do you see this as a China with, say, more Western sensibilities in terms of policy choices, the Washington consensus or whatever? Or do you see, and also the dedication for democracy and stuff? Or do you see this as a China but with more majoritarianism, maybe growing radicalization in the society, and sort of worries you that is not going in the right direction? How do you sort of see India from outside?
I absolutely insist, though, the very first thing we should do is insist that China and India are sui generis. They're not like each other, they're not like anything else. I mean, these are 1/6 and 1/6 of humanity. These are ancient civilizations with their own complex logics. Like, let's not try and subsume them under any other category. I mean, my basic line on China and the middle income trap is, why would you extrapolate from the experience of half a dozen much smaller countries without China's governance, its very particular history and the role of the party as this extraordinary agent of political governance? Why would you extrapolate from their experience to China? I mean, there are some basic mechanisms you could point to. There's some structural similarities between the Japanese housing crisis of the early 1990s and what China's experienced, but otherwise these are radically distinct. And India, again, India is not just radically distinct, but itself so astonishingly diverse, right? Inside, it is such a profoundly complex. I mean, what I've come to realize as a European is it's like the EU, but 7 times more complicated, like at least. Like it's 3 times bigger and much, much more diverse internally. And just in the process of creating one nation, one tax, actually going through the process of creating an integrated economic unit. Yeah. So to my mind, it's not like anything else, right? Full stop. And the Indian experiment with democracy is also radically sui generis. Whatever you may think of the BJP, and that's beside the point in my case, like, it is undoubtedly the most dramatic vote-winning, vote-getting machine that democracy anywhere in the history of humanity has ever produced. Like, it's sui generis in this respect. Like, no one's ever faced a machine like this before that has been able to dominate the electoral system of a country this size as successfully as this, right? First of all, we should just stand in awe and try and take in what's happening here. Is it liberal? No. Is it true to the principles of the Constitution of India after independence? No, clearly not. It's trying to modify them. Those were always contested from the very beginning. And essentially there's been a struggle within India over those principles in which the more secular, some would say more Western-orientated group was lost to this other force, which will, as far as we can see, dominate India's trajectory going forward. Will it face resistance? Clearly it already does, right? Because it's essentially a northern, central Indian phenomenon. It faces very different logics in the south of this huge country. On the other hand, whose economic dynamism is more dramatic than those of the north, right? So there are these profound internal questions, which are not surprising given India's diversity, but are going to, I think, drive the future trajectory. So I think for me, the question is, can growth be sustained? Can the break with the Hindu rate of growth be maintained? There's no reason to doubt that it can be. Does that lead you towards a Chinese experience? It doesn't, because China has foreclosed that. China is there, right? There was a space in the world history at the moment that China exploded, which China has occupied and has changed the game for everyone, right? Bangladesh is possible because of China. And because Bangladesh is doing the textiles and garments thing, India's not going to do that. So there are a series of chain reactions that follow. India really does have to craft its own path. And I agree that the central issue is inclusion, not just in the sense of cultural inclusion and this majoritarianism, which is based around Hindutva, is basically saying this is the common denominator. It also has to be made real in terms of access to material resources. And steps are clearly being made. The BJP is not blind to this. Think about the toilets campaign or something like that. There is a commitment to a certain minimum standard of living for all citizens. But thickening that and making it more dynamic, right? So that it isn't simply a kind of hold-in-place survivalism, where basically you have a society divided between an affluent group that's breaking away into super high levels of consumption, comparable with the elite in the West, and then a population that's basically being kept quiet with smartphones and cheap rice, right? That is presumably the nightmare, right? There's no longer a nightmare of failed state. India's not going to be Nigeria, right? Because these are the big comparisons now. Forget China. Place China somewhere else on the board. Like, Nigeria is the question, right? It's going to have a population of 400 or 500 million. It will be the 3rd or 4th largest country in the world. It has no developmental model at all. It has no welfare state model at all. So the question really is, what is India's model going to be? And can it be more than that kind of defensive, social stability orientated mechanism, and can it actually be a springboard for growth? If it is, it'll be a growth of a type we've never seen anywhere else before, right? Because it's not following the classic patterns. It's not following the heavy industrial or the manufacturing pattern in any straightforward way. It's got this super high tech sector. It's got incredible capacities in biotech and health if it wanted to develop those and was willing to spend more than 3% of GDP. there were these growth nodes that you could see really exploding. But no one will have charted this. We've never seen a welfare state this big, a democratic process this big, operating on this scale. And it really is a key zone for experimentation, because I think other people will want to imitate various elements of the support systems, because low-income welfare distribution models is something we're going to need, right? This is a kind of resilience. India's ability in the end to cope with COVID, which was a shambles at first, then stabilized and then becomes a success story with vaccination, that kind of learning experience is one that is going to have to be generalized the world over if we're going to deal with the challenges of the next decades.
Right. Professor Tooze, very grateful for sparing your time with the Indian Express. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you liked, please press the like button and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.